Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the ordinary turns into something you can't quite name. Tonight we're roaming the Appalachian Mountains, ancient peaks where fog rolls like ghosts and paths vanish without warning. Every story you're about to hear is rooted in truth, eyewitness accounts, family legends, and events locals still refuse to speak about after dark. This isn't a tourist guide, it's a map to the things hiding between the stones. Subscribe if you dare, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next whisper, and pull your jacket tighter. The first story rises now, like mist creeping down a hollow. Story 1. Bones in the Cellar. A family. This dark secret. I never believed in evil houses until I bought one. The Whitmore farmhouse sat on 40 acres of Nebraska cornfield, 3 hours from Omaha, with a price so low it made my realtor nervous. When I asked why, she just said the family had owned it for over a century and finally wanted out. What she didn't tell me was about the anonymous tip that had reached the county sheriff 2 weeks before I signed the papers. The house felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Not haunted wrong, but something deeper. The kind of wrong that lives in your bones and whispers warnings your rational mind refuses to hear. The floorboards creaked with voices, and the shadows in the corners moved when they shouldn't. Yeah. But I was desperate for space after my divorce, and desperate men make foolish choices. I found the cellar door on my third day there, hidden beneath a rug in the kitchen, sealed with rusted nails that looked older than the house itself. The wood was dark with age and moisture, warped beyond any hope of repair. When I pried it open, the smell that rose from below made my eyes water. Not decay exactly, but something ancient and bitter, like earth that had been disturbed too many times. The wooden steps descended into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the thick air below, revealing stone walls that wept with condensation and a dirt floor that looked freshly turned despite the house standing empty for months. Along the far wall, I could make out what appeared to be metal rings bolted into the stone, connected by chains that disappeared into the shadows. I should have called the police then. Should have walked away and let someone else deal with whatever horrors the Whitmore family had buried beneath their home. Instead, I grabbed a shovel from the barn and descended into that cellar, driven by a curiosity that felt more like compulsion. The soil moved easily beneath my blade, too easily for earth that should have been packed solid after decades. Within minutes, I struck something hard. Not rock, but bone. Human bone. Bleached white and smooth with age. As I cleared away more dirt, a complete skeleton emerged. Its wrists still locked in rusted shackles. Its skull turned toward the stairs as if it had died watching for rescue that never came. But one skeleton was just the beginning. The dirt beneath that cellar floor held 7 complete sets of human remains, some dating back decades based on the deterioration of their restraints. Men, women, even what appeared to be children, all chained to the wall, all buried in unmarked graves beneath the house where the Whitmore family had lived for over 100 years. I called the sheriff with trembling hands, barely able to form words as I described what I had found. Within hours, the farmhouse was surrounded by police cars and forensic teams, their flashing lights turning the cornfields into a nightmare landscape of red and blue shadows. The county coroner arrived with a van that seemed too small for the horror we had uncovered. The investigation that followed revealed a family secret so dark it defied comprehension. The Whitmores had been taking people for generations. Travelers who stopped at their farm seeking shelter or directions, drifters who wouldn't be missed, even neighbors who had fallen on hard times and accepted the family's offer of help. They would disappear into that cellar, and the Whitmores would tell anyone who asked that their guests had moved on in the night. Local records showed dozens of missing persons reports spanning 8 decades, all connected to the Whitmore property. People who had been seen heading toward the farm but never seen leaving. The neighbors had whispered about it for years, passing down stories of strange sounds coming from the farmhouse at night, of screams that carried across the cornfields when the wind was right. But whispers and suspicions are not enough to open graves or investigate prominent farming families. The Whitmores had been pillars of their community, active in church and local politics, always ready with a helping hand for those in need. No one wanted to believe that their charity was actually hunting, that their kindness was bait for the trap beneath their kitchen floor. The forensic examination revealed evidence of prolonged captivity. Wear marks on the bones showed that the victims had struggled against their chains for extended periods. Some skeletons showed signs of healed fractures, indicating that the Whitmores had kept their prisoners alive for months or even years. The cellar was not just a burial ground, but a dungeon where unspeakable cruelties had been practiced for nearly a century. I tried to stay in the house during the investigation, telling myself that I needed to protect my investment, that running away would solve nothing. But sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a figure reaching through the darkness. The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the evil that had been practiced there had seeped into its very foundation. On the 7th night after my discovery, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring down at the open cellar door. The excavation was complete, the bodies removed, but the darkness below still called to me with a voice that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my bones. I could feel them down there, the spirits of those who had died in chains, waiting for justice that would never fully come. The last living Whitmore, a man named Thomas who was now 83 and lived in a nursing home in Lincoln, confessed when confronted with the evidence. He claimed the killing had started with his great-grandfather during the Dust Bowl years, when desperate people would do anything for food and shelter. What began as opportunistic murder had evolved into ritual, each generation of Whitmores adding to the collection beneath their home. Thomas spoke of it with pride, as if preserving the family tradition was something noble. He described how they would select their victims, how they would gain their trust before leading them to the cellar, how they would keep them alive for weeks or months before finally ending their suffering. He spoke of it like hunting, with the casual indifference of a man describing his favorite hobby. The house was condemned after the investigation concluded. The foundation was deemed structurally compromised by the excavation. But I think the real reason was that no one could imagine living there again. The local government bought the property from me at a loss, then bulldozed everything to the ground and planted the entire 40 acres with trees. But demolishing a house cannot erase its history. The Whitmore farm may be gone, but the horror remains, preserved in court records and newspaper archives, in the nightmares of everyone who heard the story. 8 decades of systematic murder, of families destroyed and lives cut short, all hidden beneath the floorboards of a house that looked like every other farm in rural Nebraska. I moved back to the city after selling the property, but I cannot escape what I found in that cellar. Sometimes, late at night, I still smell that bitter earth and hear the rattle of chains in the darkness. I dream of faces I never saw, of voices calling from beneath the ground, of a family that turned hospitality into horror and made their home a tomb. The bones are gone now, properly buried in consecrated ground with headstones that read simply, unknown. But their story lives on, a reminder that evil can wear any face and call any place home. The Whitmore family proved that monsters are not born, they are made, and sometimes they hide behind the most ordinary facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear them calling from beneath the cornfields where that house once stood. Story 2. Phantom 911 calls of Black Mountain. I still wake up every night at exactly 3:47 a.m. That is when my phone rings with no caller ID, just static and the sound of someone breathing through what sounds like water. I know I should answer it, but I can't. Not after what I found in those mountains. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and I worked emergency dispatch in Western North Carolina for 15 years. I thought I heard everything until October 12th, when the calls started coming in from Black Mountain. The first one came through at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday night that felt too quiet, even for the mountains. The voice was male, middle-aged, desperate. He was whispering, like something might hear him if he spoke too loud. The GPS coordinates placed him deep in the Pisgah National Forest, miles from any marked trail or campground. He claimed he was lost, that his car had broken down on a road that shouldn't exist. But here, this is what made my skin crawl. The call was coming from a landline. I could trace thousands of calls, cell towers, satellites, digital networks. This wasn't any of those. The system showed an old rotary phone, the kind my grandmother had in her kitchen 40 years ago. Except this one was somehow making calls from coordinates that put it 30 feet up in the canopy of a dead oak tree. We dispatched a search team immediately. 6 experienced mountain rescue volunteers who knew every inch of that wilderness. They hiked through the night, following the GPS coordinates to the exact location. What they found defied explanation. At the base of a massive, lightning-struck oak tree, sitting on a flat rock like someone had carefully placed it there, was a black rotary phone. The receiver was off the hook, hanging by its spiral cord, still warm to the touch. The phone wasn't connected to anything. No wires, No power source, no cell signal booster. Just an antique rotary phone sitting in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest telephone pole. The search team bagged it as evidence and brought it back to the station. That's when the second call came in. This time it was a woman. She was crying, begging for help, saying something was hunting her through the trees. The GPS showed the exact same coordinates. When we checked the evidence locker, the rotary phone was gone. The locked room showed no signs of break-in, no fingerprints on the door handle, no footage on the security cameras. It had simply vanished. Over the next 3 weeks, we received 47 calls from those same coordinates. Different voices each time. Men, women, children, elderly people. All terrified, all claiming to be lost in the mountains. Some spoke clearly, others whispered through tears or screamed into the receiver before the line went dead. The background sounds were always the same. Wind through dead branches, the creak of old wood, and something else. Something that sounded like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too many feet, moving in patterns that didn't match human walking. Each time we sent search teams, they found the same rotary phone in the same spot. Each time they brought it back, it disappeared again before the next call. The mountain rescue volunteers started refusing assignments. These were people who pulled bodies from avalanches and rappelled down cliff faces in storms. But something about that dead tree spooked them in ways they couldn't explain. I decided to investigate personally on November 2nd. I'd been losing sleep over those calls, hearing the voices in my dreams, seeing the fear in their tone replay in my mind. I convinced my partner Mike to come with me. We hiked up to the coordinates during daylight, thinking we might spot something the night teams had missed. The tree stood alone in a clearing that felt too perfectly circular, like the forest had deliberately created a stage. The oak was massive, probably 200 years old, but every branch was dead black, reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The bark had strange markings, almost like tally marks, carved deep into the wood in groups of 7. I counted them while Mike examined the area where the phone always appeared. There were 47 groups of 7 marks, the exact number of calls we received. That's when Mike called out. He found something buried under the fallen leaves near the rock where the phone always sat. It was a leather journal, water damaged but readable. The pages were filled with handwritten entries dating back to 1987. All different handwriting, all different names, but all describing the same experience. They'd been hiking or camping in the mountains when they got lost. Night fell faster than it should have. The trails disappeared. Their compasses spun wildly. Their cell phones showed no signal, no GPS, nothing. Then they see a light in the distance, a warm glow coming from the base of a dead tree. When they approached, they find a rotary phone, the receiver lifted and ready. When they picked it up to call for help, they could hear the dispatcher clearly, could give their location, could beg for rescue. But the calls never went through. The phone wasn't connected to anything real. It was a trap. The journal entries described what happened next. After making the call, something would start hunting them through the forest. They could hear it moving in the darkness, always staying just out of sight, making sounds that suggested it walked on too many legs. It would herd them deeper into the mountains, away from any chance of finding their way out, until they were so exhausted and terrified that they could barely think. The last entry in the journal was from October 11th, the day before our call started. A hiker named David Morrison wrote that he could see the thing clearly now in the moonlight. It wasn't an animal. It wore the faces of everyone who made calls from that phone, stretching their features across its body like masks. It spoke in their voices, practicing what it would say when it made the calls itself. That is when I understood. The 47 voices we heard weren't the people calling for help. They were echoes, recordings the thing had made of its victims before it took them. It was using their voices to lure rescue teams into the mountains, to add to its collection. Mike and I ran back to our patrol car, but the trail had changed. Trees that hadn't been there before blocked our path. The GPS showed we were moving in circles. As darkness fell, we saw the light in the distance, that warm glow coming from the base of the dead oak tree. And we could hear the phone ringing, even from half a mile away. We never made it back to the station that night. When the morning search team found us, we were sitting at the base of that tree, staring at the rotary phone with blank expressions. They said we'd been there for 3 days, though it only felt like hours to us. They said we kept trying to pick up the phone to make a call, but our hands would pass right through it like it wasn't really there. The calls stopped after that night. The search teams never found another phone. The tree was struck by lightning a week later and burned to ash, taking the journal and any evidence with it. The official report listed the whole incident as a series of prank calls from an untraceable source. But I know better. I know because every night at 3:47 a.m., my phone rings with that same desperate voice I heard in the first call. It's my own voice, calling from those coordinates, begging someone to come help me. And I can hear something in the background, something with too many feet, learning how to sound human by practicing the words I'm saying. The thing is still out there, still collecting voices, still waiting for the next person to get lost in those mountains and see that warm light glowing in the darkness. It has my voice now, and Mike's voice, and 47 others. And every night, it calls 911 to practice what it is going to say when the next victim picks up that rotary phone. I try not to sleep anymore, because in my dreams I'm back at that tree, and the phone is ringing, and something that wears human faces like clothing is standing behind me, whispering into my ear with voices that belong to people who will never come home. The mountains remember everything, and some things should never be answered. Story 3. Hell for certain. The GPS died the exact moment I crossed into hell for certain, Kentucky. I should have turned around right then. Should have listened to the part of my brain that was screaming warnings about a town with a name like that. But I was 3 hours behind schedule, running on 2 hours of sleep, and hauling a trailer full of furniture that needed to be in Louisville by morning. The GPS had been glitching for the last 50 miles, routing me off Interstate 75 onto increasingly narrow back roads that wound through the Appalachian Mountains like arteries through a corpse. When the screen finally went black completely, I was committed. No cell signal, no landmarks, just a cracked 2-lane road disappearing into forest so thick it blocked out the afternoon sun. Hell for certain wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. The road sign was hand-painted wood, weathered gray and listing to one side like a tombstone. Population 127, though half the houses I passed looked abandoned. Front porches sagging under the weight of decades. Windows dark as dead eyes. I needed gas and directions, but the only station in town had pumps from the 1970s and a handwritten sign that said cash only. The attendant was nowhere to be found. Just an empty office with a bell that rang when I opened the door, echoing through rooms that smelled like motor oil and something else. Something organic and sweet that made my stomach turn. That is when I first saw the trees. They stood in the cemetery behind the station. 5 of them, maybe 6, scattered among the regular headstones like twisted monuments. At first glance, they looked diseased. The trunks were thick and gnarled, bark black with age. But as I got closer, the shape became unmistakable. Each tree had grown in the perfect outline of a coffin, wide at the shoulders, narrow at the feet, with branches that curved inward like the sides of a casket. The locals called them the coffin trees. I learned this from an elderly man who appeared behind me while I was staring at them. He moved without making a sound, like his feet didn't quite touch the ground. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told me the trees had been there longer than the town, longer than the cemetery, maybe longer than the mountains themselves. The first settlers had found them when they cleared the land in 1847. 5 coffin-shaped trees standing in a perfect circle. They tried to cut them down, but the axes bounced off the bark like it was made of stone. So they built around them, made the cemetery fit the trees instead of the other way around. Over the years, people had been buried near the trees, good Christian folk who deserved proper rest. But the trees had other ideas. The bodies never stayed buried. Not zombies rising from the grave, the old man explained. Nothing that dramatic. The coffins would just work their way to the surface over time, pushed up by roots that grew underneath them. By morning, you'd find wooden boxes sitting on top of the earth like packages waiting to be delivered. After the 3rd time it happened, the town stopped using that part of the cemetery, stopped going near the trees altogether. The bodies that had already been disturbed were moved to other locations. All except 5 settlers whose coffins wouldn't budge no matter how many men tried to move them. Those coffins had sunk into the earth at the base of each tree, disappeared completely, like the ground had swallowed them. But if you stood close enough on quiet nights, you could still hear them. The settlers, scratching at their coffin lids, trying to claw their way out of graves that went deeper than graves should go. The old man finished his story and walked away without another word. Left me standing alone among the headstones as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in as many minutes, and mist began rising from the ground like smoke. I should have left then. Should have found another route to Louisville, even if it meant driving all night. But something about the trees held me there. Something hypnotic about their perfect, impossible shape. Like they were calling to me. I walked closer. The bark was rough under my hand, cold as winter stone. As I traced the outline of the nearest tree, I felt something else. A vibration, so faint I might have imagined it, like a heartbeat deep underground. That is when I noticed the ground around each tree was different. Darker, richer. The grass grew thicker here, greener despite the approaching autumn, and there were patterns in the earth, subtle depressions that formed shapes. Rectangles, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Coffin shapes pressed into the soil. The mist was getting thicker, swirling around the trees like living things. In the growing darkness, I could swear I saw movement in the fog. Shadows that walked upright, shapes that looked almost human but moved wrong somehow. I backed away from the trees and nearly tripped over something hard. Looking down, I saw a corner of wood poking through the earth. Dark, weathered pine that looked like it had been underground for decades. A coffin, working its way to the surface just like the old man had described. The wood was warm to the touch. Not just warm, but pulsing with heat like fever. And from inside, I could hear something moving. Something scratching against the interior walls with fingernails that had grown long in the darkness. I ran, sprinted back to my truck and trailer, fumbling with keys that suddenly felt foreign in my hands. The engine turned over on the third try, and I peeled out of the cemetery so fast that gravel sprayed against the headstones like gunshot. But as I drove away, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. The mist had cleared, and I could see the trees clearly in the moonlight. All 5 of them were glowing, not with any light I recognized, but with something deeper, something that came from inside the wood itself. And at the base of each tree, coffins were emerging from the earth, rising like elevators, bringing their occupants back to a world they left more than a century ago. I drove straight through the night, didn't stop until I reached Louisville, delivered the furniture, and immediately drove home to Tennessee. But I couldn't stop thinking about those trees. Couldn't shake the feeling that I witnessed something that had been happening for generations. A cycle that repeated itself whenever someone new discovered the cemetery. 3 days later, I made the mistake of researching hell for certain online. What I found made me wish I never heard the name. The town had been founded in 1847, just like the old man said. But the records were wrong about everything else. The population had never been 127. It had never been more than 5 families. The same 5 families whose ancestors were buried beneath the coffin trees. According to county records, the last permanent resident of hell for certain had died in 1923. The town had been officially abandoned for over a century. The post office, the general store, the gas station where I stopped, all of them had been closed since the 1920s. But the real horror was in the death certificates. 5 settlers had died in the winter of 1847, all within a week of each other. All from the same cause: starvation. They made a pact with something in those mountains, traded their lives for a good harvest that never came. Their names were carved into the trees, not on headstones, but burned into the bark itself. Names that grew more prominent each year as the trees aged. Names that could only be read by moonlight when the wood glowed with its own inner fire. I know this because I went back. Couldn't help myself. The need to see those trees again had been growing in my mind like a cancer. 3 weeks after my first visit, I found myself driving the same route through the mountains, following roads that shouldn't exist to a town that had been dead for a century. The cemetery was exactly as I left it. The coffins had returned to their underground rest, but the impression they left in the soil was still visible, still warm to the touch, and the trees had grown, not taller, but thicker, like they had been feeding on something rich and nourishing. This time, I brought a flashlight and a camera, documented everything I could see: the names in the bark, the coffin-shaped depressions in the earth, the way the mist seemed to move with purpose around the base of each tree. But when I got home and tried to download the photos, they were all black. Every single image, corrupted or deleted, like something had reached through the camera and erased the evidence of its existence. The only proof I have is the name burned into my memory. Hell for certain. A town that exists in the spaces between maps. A place where the dead made bargains they couldn't keep, and trees grew in shapes that nature never intended. I haven't been back since that second visit. Dawn, I plan to go back. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about those trees. Dream about coffins rising from the earth and settlers who have been scratching at wooden lids for over a century. Dream about mist that moves like smoke from a fire that burns underground. And in those dreams, I'm not just a visitor to hell for certain. I am a resident, standing at the base of a sixth tree that wasn't there before. A tree that grew in the shape of my own coffin, waiting for me to complete a bargain I remember making. Waiting for me to come home. Story 4. Song of the Coal Miner. I never believed in omens until I heard dead men singing 300 feet underground. My name is Marcus Webb, and they've been a mining foreman in the Appalachian coal country for 22 years. I've seen cave-ins, gas explosions, and men crushed by machinery that weighs more than a school bus. But nothing prepared me for what happened in the abandoned sections of the Black Rock mine last September. The trouble started when corporate decided to reopen Shaft 7. It had been sealed for 30 years after a collapse killed 11 miners back in 1993. The families sued, the mine paid out, and everyone agreed to let the dead rest. But coal prices were up, and dead miners donned to vote on corporate boards. I was the one who had to break through the concrete barrier. The company brought in specialists with diamond-tipped drills and enough dynamite to level a city block. As the barrier cracked open, cold air rushed out like the mountain was exhaling after holding its breath for 3 decades. The smell hit us first. Not decay or rot like you might expect, but something else. Something metallic and bitter, like copper pennies left in your mouth too long. It made my teeth ache just breathing it in. My crew consisted of 5 good men. Jimmy Rodriguez had been mining since he was 18, following in his grandfather's footsteps. Pete Kowalski was fresh out of technical school but learned fast and kept his mouth shut. The Murphy twins, Sean and Kevin, worked like they shared the same brain, finishing each other's safety checks without speaking. And there was old Tom Brennan, 63 years old and planning to retire after this job. We entered Shaft 7 on a Tuesday morning in September. The air was crisp outside, but down in the tunnels, it felt thick and oppressive, like breathing through wet wool. Our helmet lights cut through darkness that seemed to push back against the beams. The main tunnel stretched ahead for 200 yards before branching into smaller passages. The walls were solid coal seam, black as midnight and rich enough to make the company executives salivate. But I noticed something wrong immediately. The support beams were intact. Too intact. After 30 years of abandonment, they should have shown signs of deterioration, rot, or settling. Instead, they looked like they had been installed yesterday. We set up our equipment and began the standard safety checks. Gas levels normal, structural integrity good, everything by the book. But as we worked deeper into the tunnel system, I started feeling watched. Not by the other men or by management from up top, by something else, something that had been waiting in the darkness for a very long time. It was Jimmy who heard it first. We were about an hour into our shift, installing new support cables in the main tunnel, when he stopped working and tilted his head like a dog listening to a whistle only he could hear. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. We all stopped and listened. The usual sounds of the mine filled the silence. Water dripping somewhere in the distance, the settling and creaking of old wood, the hum of our equipment, but underneath it all, something else. Something that made the hair on my neck stand up like I had been struck by lightning. Singing, faint but unmistakable, male voices harmonizing in a low, mournful tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were too distant to make out, but the melody was hauntingly familiar. An old mining song my grandfather used to hum when he thought nobody was listening. "Probably just acoustics," I said, more to convince myself than the others. "Sound carries strange in these tunnels. Could be coming from anywhere." But Pete was already checking his instruments, his face pale in the glow of his helmet light. "Boss," he said, his voice tight with concern. "These readings don't make sense. The sound is coming from Tunnel C." Tunnel C had been completely collapsed for 30 years. I had seen the engineering reports myself. 20,000 tons of rock and coal had crushed that section flat, sealing it off like a tomb. Nothing could be living down there, let alone singing. The voices grew stronger as we worked, weaving in and out of our consciousness like a radio station fading in and out of range. Sometimes we could almost make out words. Something about darkness and depth. About men who went down and never came back up. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a funeral hymn sung by angels with broken wings. Old Tom was the first to crack. He had been getting more and more agitated as the morning wore on, jumping at shadows and checking his watch every few minutes. When the singing reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the tunnel, he threw down his tools and backed toward the exit. "I'm not dying down here," he said, his weathered face streaked with coal dust and fear. "Not like this, not singing their damn songs." I tried to calm him down, but he was already walking away, his helmet light bouncing wildly as he stumbled toward the shaft entrance. The rest of us watched him go, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Maybe old Tom had the right idea, but we had a job to finish, and walking away would mean answering to corporate. So we kept working, even as the voices grew louder and more distinct. Even as they began to sound less like a distant echo and more like men standing right next to us in the darkness. By lunchtime, we could make out individual voices, a bass that rumbled like thunder through the tunnels, a tenor that soared above the others with heartbreaking clarity, and underneath it all, a whispered harmony that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They were singing the Ballad of John Henry, but the words were wrong. Instead of celebrating the legendary steel driving man, this version was darker, more ominous. It spoke of men who dug too deep, who awakened things that should have stayed sleeping, who paid the price for disturbing the mountain, its ancient secrets. The Murphy twins were next to go. They had been working side by side, installing ventilation equipment, when Kevin suddenly grabbed his brother's arm. Without a word, they both turned and walked toward the exit, moving in perfect synchronization like they were marching to the rhythm of the ghostly chorus. That left just Jimmy, Pete, and me. 3 men alone in a tunnel system that stretched for miles underground, with only the dead for company. "We should get out of here," Pete said, his young voice cracking with fear. "This isn't normal. This isn't safe." But Jimmy was staring into the darkness of Tunnel C, his face lit with a strange fascination. "They were trying to tell us something," he said. "The voices, they were warning us." As if summoned by his words, the singing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any ghost song could ever be. It was the silence of held breath, of something massive and patient waiting for the right moment to strike. Then the ground began to shake. It started as a low rumble, like a freight train passing overhead. But we were 300 feet underground. There were no trains down here. Only coal and rock and the bones of men who had died 3 decades ago. The shaking grew stronger, and I realized with cold certainty what was happening. The same thing that had killed 11 miners in 1993 was about to happen again. The mountain was coming down. "Run!" I shouted. But my voice was lost in the growing roar of shifting stone and snapping support beams. Pete was already moving, his young legs carrying him toward the exit faster than I thought possible. Jimmy hesitated for a moment, still staring at the sealed entrance to Tunnel C, before following. I was the last to run, and as I did, I heard the voices one final time. Not singing now, but speaking in unison. Their words crystal clear in the chaos of the collapsing mine. "Welcome, brother," they said. "Welcome home." The ceiling came down 20 feet behind me, sealing off the tunnel in a cascade of rock and dust. We made it to the surface just as the entire section collapsed, taking with it millions of dollars in equipment and corporate dreams. The official report blamed faulty geological surveys and unstable rock formations weakened by decades of water damage. No mention was made of the singing voices or the warnings from the dead. Corporate quietly sealed the mine permanently this time, writing off the loss and moving operations to a safer location. But I know the truth. I know that some places are meant to stay buried, and some songs are meant to stay unsung. The men who died in Tunnel C in 1993 had been trying to warn us, trying to save us from joining their eternal chorus. Old Tom retired the next week. The Murphy twins transferred to a surface job. Pete quit mining altogether and went back to school. Jimmy disappeared one night, and they found his truck parked outside the sealed mine entrance. His body was never recovered. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, you can hear them singing down there. All of them together now, their voices carrying through the mountain like a warning to anyone fool enough to listen. They sing the old songs, the mining songs, the songs of men who went too deep and never came back up. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can hear Jimmy's voice among them, adding his tenor to their eternal dirge, welcoming the next group of miners who think they know better than the dead. Story 5. Norfolk and Western Wreck. The screams started coming through the radio at 11:47 p.m. exactly 70 years after the Norfolk and Western passenger train derailed in Devil is Hollow. I know because I was the engineer who heard them first. My name is Tom Kellner, and they've been running freight trains through the Virginia mountains for 23 years. I thought I'd seen everything these tracks could throw at me until October 15th, when the dead decided they weren't and finished riding the rails. The Iron Corridor runs from Roanoke to Bluefield, cutting through some of the most remote terrain in Appalachia. 47 miles of curves and grades that test even experienced engineers. The company calls it a challenging route. Locals call it cursed. They have good reason. The Norfolk and Western passenger train that derailed in 1954 was carrying 86 people when it hit Devil is Hollow doing 60 miles per hour. Track failures sent the locomotive and 6 cars tumbling into the ravine. 34 people died instantly. Another dozen died before rescue crews could reach them. The railway company rebuilt the track and installed modern safety systems, but engineers still reported strange incidents. Phantom signals that showed clear track when maintenance crews found nothing. Radio interference that sounded like distant voices. And always on the anniversary, something that made veteran railmen quit and never come back. I heard the stories but never believed them, until I was pulling a 100-car coal train through Devil is Hollow at 11:45 p.m. on October 15th, running 2 hours behind schedule because of a mechanical delay in Roanoke. The first sign something was wrong came through the radio. Static that gradually resolved into what sounded like period music from the 1950s. Big band sound, the kind they would have played in passenger cars to entertain travelers on long journeys. I checked with dispatch, but they weren't transmitting anything unusual. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere along the track itself, broadcast on our frequency by some kind of local interference. Then I saw the lights ahead. Not signal lights or crossing warnings, but the warm yellow glow of passenger car windows. A train was sitting on the track directly in my path, maybe half a mile ahead in the straightaway before Devil is Hollow. I hit the emergency brakes and grabbed the radio, calling dispatch with a priority alert. Runaway train on the main line, possible collision imminent. But when the dispatcher checked the system, no other trains were scheduled on that section of track. The phantom train began to move as my freight consist slowed. Not forward along the rails, but sideways, tilting at an impossible angle as if the cars were sliding down an invisible embankment. Through my windshield, I could see silhouettes of passengers pressed against the windows, their mouths open in silent screams. My train shuddered to a stop just as the passenger cars vanished into darkness. The track ahead was clear, just empty rails gleaming in my headlights. But the smell of coal smoke and burning wood drifted through my cab windows, and the radio continued playing that tinny 1950s dance music. I should have reported what I saw and requested relief, should have followed protocol and waited for a supervisor to investigate. Instead, I released the brakes and continued toward Devil is Hollow, drawn by a curiosity that overrode every safety instinct I developed in 2 decades of railroading. The music grew louder as I approached the curve where the original derailment occurred. Now I could make out individual instruments, hear the scratch and pop of an old recording played through damaged speakers. But underneath the melody was something else. Voices. Dozens of voices talking and laughing. The sound of a crowded passenger car on a pleasant evening journey. That's when I noticed the figures on the track. They stood in groups of 2 or 3, scattered along both sides of the rails like they were waiting for a train to arrive. Men in dark suits and fedoras, women in the kind of dresses people wore for special occasions in the 1950s. All of them perfectly motionless, facing toward my approaching locomotive. As my headlights swept over them, I could see their faces clearly. Pale and expressionless, with dark hollows where their eyes should have been. Some were obviously injured, their clothing torn and stained, their bodies positioned at angles that suggested broken bones. But they were standing upright, watching my train approach with the patient attention of commuters waiting for their ride. I blew the horn, a long blast that echoed off the mountain walls. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge the warning in any way. They simply stood there as my 100-car freight train bore down on them at 30 miles per hour. I closed my eyes just before impact, expecting to feel the sickening bump of bodies under the wheels. Instead, my train passed through the crowd like they were made of smoke and memory. When I opened my eyes, the track behind me was empty. But the radio was now picking up something that made my blood freeze. Voices calling out in panic and pain. The sound of metal grinding against metal, wood splintering, glass breaking. Emergency personnel shouting instructions, trying to coordinate rescue efforts in the chaos following a major derailment. I was listening to a recording of the original Norfolk and Western disaster, broadcast on my radio frequency exactly 70 years after it happened. The transmission grew more intense as I entered the curve at Devil's Hollow. I could hear individual passengers calling for help, their voices clear and desperate. A woman crying for her husband, a man trapped under debris, begging someone to help lift the beam that was crushing his legs. Most disturbing was the conductor, his professional calm cracking as he tried to maintain order in the wreckage. His voice came through my radio with startling clarity, as if he were standing right beside me in the cab. He was calling out passenger names from a manifest, trying to account for everyone aboard the doomed train. The list seemed to go on forever, each name followed by either confirmation of safety or the terrible silence that meant another life lost. That's when I heard my own name. Thomas Kellner, Car 4, C23A. The conductor's voice spoke my name with the same professional intonation he used for the others, then paused as if waiting for my response. But I wasn't on that passenger train in 1954. I wasn't even born until 1963. There was no way my name could be on a manifest from 70 years ago. Unless the disaster wasn't finished claiming victims. I grabbed the radio and tried to contact dispatch, but the frequency was completely overwhelmed by the sounds of the derailment. Screaming passengers, shouting rescue workers, the groaning of twisted metal settling in the ravine below. My freight train was now moving through the exact spot where the passenger cars had left the rails in 1954. I could feel something wrong with the track beneath my wheels. A subtle vibration that suggested the rails were shifting under the weight of my consist. Through the side windows, I caught glimpses of the original wreckage in the ravine. Not the rusted remains that should have been there after 7 decades, but fresh devastation. Cars crumpled like paper, their windows blown out, steam rising from the overturned locomotive. Rescue crews moved through the debris with period equipment, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the mountainside. But when I looked directly at the scene, everything appeared normal. Just empty forest and the dark creek that ran through the bottom of Devil's Hollow. The phantom disaster existed only in my peripheral vision, like a memory that refused to fade. My radio crackled with a new transmission. The conductor again, his voice now strained with exhaustion and grief. He was updating the casualty count, reporting to some distant dispatcher who would relay the information to company headquarters. 34 confirmed dead, he said. 12 critical, may not survive transport to hospital. And one more name added to the manifest. Thomas Kellner, presumed missing, last seen in the vicinity of Car 4. I was being retroactively added to a passenger list from 70 years before my birth. Somehow, the disaster was reaching across time to claim me as a delayed casualty. That's when I understood what happened to the other engineers who quit after working this route on the anniversary. They'd been marked by the wreckage, tagged for collection by the restless dead of the Norfolk and Western. The lucky ones had recognized the danger and escaped before it was too late. The unlucky ones had tried to ignore what they'd seen and heard, convinced themselves it was just their imagination or equipment malfunction. Those engineers had a tendency to disappear during subsequent runs through Devil's Hollow. The company blamed fatigue, medical emergencies, personal problems. But their bodies were never found, and their locomotives were usually discovered stopped on the track with no sign of what had happened to the crew. I was about to join their ranks unless I could figure out how to break the connection between my train and the phantom passenger manifest. The answer came to me as I cleared the curve and began the long climb out of Devil's Hollow. The voices on the radio were growing fainter, the music fading back to static. Whatever force was trying to claim me was tied to that specific location, that exact stretch of track where the original disaster occurred. But it would keep trying every time I passed through. Every run on this route would bring me closer to being permanently added to the ghost train's passenger list. I made a decision that ended my railroad career but saved my life. When I reached the next signal, I stopped my train and radioed dispatch with a medical emergency. Chest pains, shortness of breath, possible heart attack. The kind of symptoms that would get me immediate relief and transportation to a hospital. The replacement engineer who took over my train was a 20-year veteran named Mike Rodriguez. Good man. Solid reputation, the kind of railroader who could handle any situation. He completed the run to Bluefield without incident and filed a routine trip report. But 3 weeks later, during his next scheduled run through Devil's Hollow, Mike locomotive was found stopped on the main line at 11:47 p.m. The emergency brakes were set, the cab doors were open, but Mike Rodriguez was nowhere to be found. The company investigation concluded he suffered some kind of medical emergency and wandered away from his train in a state of confusion. Search teams combed the mountains for weeks without finding a trace. But I know what really happened to Mike Rodriguez. His name was called from the Phantom Passenger Manifest. And this time, someone answered. I'd never worked the Iron Corridor again. Took early retirement, moved to Florida, tried to forget what I experienced in Devil's Hollow. But every October 15th, I hear the music on old radio frequencies. Big band sound from the 1950s, mixed with voices that call out passenger names from a train that derailed 70 years ago. Sometimes I hear my own name among the others. Thomas Kellner, Car 4, Seat 23A. A ticket I never bought for a journey I never took, on a train that is still trying to complete its run through the Virginia mountains. The Norfolk and Western Wreck ISN, to history. It's an ongoing disaster, collecting new passengers every year from among the living who work the rails through Devil's Hollow. They rebuilt the track, but they never laid the souls to rest. And until someone figures out how to do that, the Iron Corridor will keep claiming engineers who hear their names called from the radio static, who see phantom lights on empty track, who make the mistake of answering when the dead ask if they ready to board. Still with me? Good. Hit subscribe and the bell so the next whisper finds you first. Tell us in the comments where you're listening. Maybe your own woods aren't so different from these. Story 6. White Lady of the Lucy Selina. A riverboat. This eternal bride. I should have listened to the locals when they warned me about fishing alone on the Ohio River after midnight. 3 weeks ago, I thought their stories about the White Lady were just small-town folklore designed to keep tourists away from the best fishing spots. Now I know better. Now I know that some legends are born from blood and water, and some ghosts refuse to stay buried beneath the muddy current. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a commercial fisherman from Cincinnati who has worked these waters for 15 years. I have pulled catfish from the deepest channels, navigated through fog so thick you could not see your own hands, and weathered storms that turned the river into a churning nightmare of debris and death. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I encountered 3 miles downstream from the Markland Dam on a September night that changed everything I thought I knew about the dead. The evening started like any other. I launched my 20-foot bass boat from the public ramp in Madison, Indiana, just as the sun was setting behind the Kentucky hills. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the first stars with perfect clarity, and the air carried that crisp autumn smell that promised good fishing and peaceful solitude. My sonar showed schools of sauger moving through the deeper channels, and I was confident I would return home with a full cooler and another successful night on the water. I anchored near a sunken barge that had been resting on the bottom for decades, its rusted hull providing shelter for the kind of fish that made commercial fishing profitable. The silence was complete except for the gentle lapping of water against my boat and the distant hum of traffic crossing the bridge upstream. It was the kind of peace that city dwellers pay thousands of dollars to experience, and I was getting it for free in my own backyard. The first sign something was wrong came around midnight when my fish finder started displaying readings that made no sense. The screen showed a large mass moving slowly through the water column, too big to be a fish but too fluid to be debris. It appeared to be ascending from the deepest part of the channel, rising toward the surface with deliberate purpose. I adjusted the sensitivity settings, thinking it was equipment malfunction, but the readings remained consistent and disturbing. Then I heard the singing. Faint at first, barely audible above the sound of water against my hull, but growing stronger with each passing minute. It was a woman, its voice, high and clear, carrying a melody I did not recognize but that somehow felt familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. The song seemed to be coming from the water itself, drifting up from the depths with an otherworldly beauty that made my skin crawl even as it captivated my attention. I scanned the riverbank with my spotlight, looking for the source of the voice, but the beam revealed nothing except empty shoreline and the skeletal remains of an old dock that had collapsed years ago. The singing continued, growing louder and more distinct, and I realized with growing unease that it was moving closer to my boat. Whatever was making that sound was in the water, approaching from the darkness beyond my lights. That was when I first saw her, a pale figure moving through the water near the opposite bank, white fabric billowing around her like smoke. At first I thought it was debris, maybe a plastic bag or piece of canvas caught in the current. But as I watched, the figure resolved into the unmistakable shape of a woman in a wedding dress, her veil trailing behind her as she glided just beneath the surface. She moved against the current with impossible grace, her dress remaining pristine white despite the muddy water that surrounded her. Her face was turned toward my boat, and even from a distance of 50 yards, I could see her eyes reflecting my spotlight like mirrors. She was beautiful in the way that Renaissance paintings depict angels, but there was something wrong with her beauty, something that made my primitive brain scream warnings about danger. The white lady stopped singing and began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the water despite the distance between us. She asked if I had seen her groom, if I knew where he might be waiting for her to finish their ceremony. Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if we were old acquaintances meeting by chance rather than strangers encountering each other in the middle of a dark river. I knew I should start my engine and return to shore, but something about her voice held me frozen in place. She spoke with the accent of an earlier era, using words and phrases that belonged to the 19th century, and her manner suggested a refinement that spoke of wealth and education. She was not the ghost of some poor unfortunate who had drowned by accident. This was someone who had lived a life of privilege before meeting her fate in these waters. As she spoke, she began to move closer to my boat, and I could see more details of her appearance. Her wedding dress was elaborate, with layers of silk and lace that would have cost a fortune when new. Her dark hair was arranged in an intricate style held in place by pins that gleamed like silver in my spotlight. Around her throat was a necklace of pearls that seemed to glow with their own internal light. But it was her eyes that captured my attention and held it with hypnotic power. They were not the clouded eyes of a drowning victim, but clear and intelligent, filled with a desperate longing that transcended death itself. She was searching for something, someone, with a need so powerful it had kept her spirit anchored to this world for over a century. I found my voice and asked who she was looking for, though every instinct told me I should remain silent. She smiled then, an expression of such radiant joy that it transformed her ethereal beauty into something almost divine. She said she was looking for Thomas, her beloved Thomas, who had promised to meet her at the altar aboard the Lucy Selina on their wedding day in 1887. The Lucy Selina. I knew that name from local history, though I had never paid much attention to the old stories. It was a paddle-wheel steamboat that had operated passenger service between Cincinnati and Louisville in the late 1800s. The boat had been converted for special occasions, including weddings, and was considered one of the finest vessels on the Ohio River until it sank in a storm that claimed dozens of lives. She told me her story as she continued to approach, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had repeated the same tale countless times. Her name was Margaret Whitfield, daughter of a wealthy Louisville businessman who had arranged her marriage to Thomas Brennan, heir to a shipping fortune. Their wedding was to be the social event of the season, held aboard the Lucy Selina as it traveled between their respective hometowns. The ceremony had been perfect, she said, with 200 guests and a feast that included delicacies imported from New York and New Orleans. She had worn her grandmother's wedding dress and her mother's pearl necklace, and Thomas had looked so handsome in his formal attire that she thought her heart might burst from happiness. They had exchanged vows as the sun set over the river, promising to love each other through all eternity. But eternity had come sooner than expected. A sudden storm had caught the Lucy Selina in the deepest part of the channel, and the old boat had not been designed to handle the massive waves that rolled down from the north. The paddle wheel had broken free, throwing the vessel off balance, and within minutes the pride of the Ohio River had become a death trap for everyone aboard. Margaret had been swept overboard while still wearing her wedding dress, the heavy silk and layers of petticoats dragging her down into the dark water. She had called out for Thomas as she sank, expecting him to jump in and save her as he had promised he always would. But Thomas was already gone, crushed beneath falling timbers when the upper deck collapsed, and her cries went unanswered in the chaos of the sinking. She had drowned alone, separated from her new husband by fate and physics, and her final thought had been a desperate wish that she could find him and complete their union in whatever world waited beyond death. That wish had been so powerful it had kept her spirit bound to the river, searching endlessly for the man she had married and lost in the same terrible hour. Now she floated beside my boat, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her pale hand. Up close, I could see the details that distance had obscured. Her skin had the translucent quality of fine porcelain, and her dress moved with the rhythm of invisible currents. Water did not drip from her hair or clothing, as if the laws of physics bent around her presence. She asked again if I had seen Thomas, If I knew where she might find him so they could be together as they had promised. Her eyes searched my face with desperate hope, and I felt the weight of her century-long vigil pressing down on my soul. This was not malevolent haunting but tragic love story, and I found myself genuinely wanting to help her find peace. I told her gently that Thomas had died in the same accident that claimed her life, that he had been waiting for her on the other side for over 100 years. But my words seemed to slide off her consciousness without impact, as if her mind could not process information that contradicted her desperate hope. She simply smiled and asked again about her groom, caught in a loop of denial that death itself could not break. Then her demeanor changed. The pleading hope in her eyes shifted to something darker, more demanding. She reached up with one pale hand and grasped the side of my boat, and I felt the fiberglass hull grow cold beneath her touch. Her voice took on an edge of hysteria as she insisted that I must know where Thomas was hiding, that I was lying to keep them apart. The temperature around my boat dropped by 20 degrees in an instant, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Ice crystals formed on my fishing gear, and the water around Margaret began to churn with supernatural energy. Her beautiful face contorted with rage and desperation, revealing the madness that a century of searching had carved into her spirit. She pulled herself higher out of the water, and I saw that her wedding dress was torn and stained with mud from the river bottom. The pearls at her throat were cracked and discolored, and her hair hung in tangles that no amount of careful arrangement could disguise. This was not the refined lady she pretended to be, but the broken remnant of someone who had refused to accept the finality of death. Margaret began to climb into my boat with strength that no drowned spirit should possess. Her hands left wet handprints on everything she touched, but the water was ice cold and smelled of decay and river mud. I scrambled backward, trying to reach my engine controls, but she moved with inhuman speed to block my escape. She grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like frozen steel, and suddenly I was not in my boat anymore. I was underwater, surrounded by the wreckage of the Lucy Selina, watching dozens of wedding guests struggle against their heavy period clothing as they sank into the dark depths. I could see Thomas Brennan trapped beneath a fallen beam, his eyes wide with terror as the water filled his lungs. But more terrifying was the realization that Margaret had been pulling men into the river for decades, convinced that each one might be her missing groom. The bottom of the Ohio was littered with the bones of fishermen and boaters who had encountered the White Lady on dark nights like this one. She killed them not from malice but from desperate hope, dragging them down to examine their faces in the underwater graveyard where she made her home. I broke free from her grasp and fell backward into my boat, gasping for air and clawing at the engine controls with numb fingers. The motor roared to life just as Margaret reached for me again, her face twisted with fury at being denied another potential Thomas. I gunned the throttle and shot away from her grasping hands, looking back to see her standing on the surface of the water, screaming my name with a voice that carried impossible distances. I made it back to the boat ramp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie off the lines. The dock lights seemed like beacons of safety after the supernatural darkness I had escaped, and the mundane sounds of traffic and civilization were more beautiful than any music I had ever heard. But Margaret followed me home. She appeared in my bathroom mirror that first night, asking about Thomas with the same desperate hope. She stands in my backyard when it rains, her wedding dress glowing in the darkness, searching the shadows for her eternal groom. She whispers his name through my bedroom walls, a sound that no amount of insulation can muffle. I have not returned to the Ohio River since that night 3 weeks ago. My boat sits unused in the driveway, and my fishing gear gathers dust in the garage. But I know she is waiting for me, somewhere in the dark water near the sunken remains of the Lucy Selina, ready to ask her eternal question of any man unfortunate enough to cross her path. The locals were right to warn me about fishing alone after midnight. Some stories are more than folklore, and some ghosts refuse to rest until they find what they are looking for. Margaret Whitfield has been searching for her groom for over a century, and she will continue searching until someone finally helps her understand that love, no matter how powerful, cannot conquer the finality of death. But understanding and acceptance are different things, and the White Lady of the Lucy Selina remains trapped between worlds, forever asking the same heartbreaking question of every man she meets in the darkness of the Ohio River. Story 7. Melungeon Curse of Newman. This ridge I found my great-grandfather. This journal 3 days after I inherited his house. And now I understand why my family never talks about our past. Some secrets are buried for good reason, but the dead have a way of making sure the truth eventually surfaces. My name is Tom Whitaker, and I am a real estate appraiser from Knoxville. I thought I knew my family history until I discovered that leather-bound book hidden behind a false wall in the basement. The pages were yellow with age, filled with my great-grandfather, his careful handwriting dating back to 1923. What I read changed everything I thought I knew about the Whitakers and why we've been dying young for generations. The journal started with a simple entry about purchasing land on Newman Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee. 140 acres of prime mountain property for a fraction of its worth. My great-grandfather, Samuel Whitaker, was proud of the deal he struck with the county courthouse. The previous owners had simply vanished, he wrote, leaving no forwarding address and no family to claim the property. The land reverted to the county, and Samuel swooped in with the winning bid. But as I read deeper, the real story emerged. Samuel hadn't bought vacant land. He stolen the ancestral home of a Melungeon family named the Goins who had lived on that ridge for over 200 years. The Melungeon people were one of the most mysterious groups in American history. Mixed-race families who settled in the remote mountains of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia long before anyone kept proper records. They claimed to be Portuguese, or Turkish, or Cherokee, depending on who was asking and what would keep them safest. The truth was more complex. They were descendants of European settlers, escaped slaves, and Native Americans who had intermarried and created their own isolated communities in the high ridges where the government rarely bothered to look. Samuel's journal revealed what really happened to the Goins family. They hadn't vanished voluntarily. In the spring of 1922, Samuel had worked with corrupt county officials to forge documents claiming the family owed massive back taxes on land they owned for generations. When the Goins couldn't produce receipts for taxes that had never been properly assessed, the county seized the property and put it up for auction. The family patriarch, Melungeon Goins, was 93 years old and had been born on that ridge. His grandfather had cleared the first fields with his bare hands. They begged for more time, offered to work off the debt, pleaded with anyone who would listen. But Samuel and his partners in the courthouse had already decided the land would be theirs. On the day the sheriff came to evict them, something went wrong. Samuel's journal entry from June 15, 1922, was shaky, written in what looked like blood rather than ink. The Goins family had gathered in their ancestral home, 3 generations of people who had nowhere else to go. Samuel was there to take possession of his new property, but he found them in the main room, sitting in a perfect circle, holding hands. They were chanting in a language Samuel didn't recognize, words that seemed to twist the air and make the shadows move independently of their bodies. Melungeon Goins looked directly at Samuel as he spoke, and Samuel wrote that the old man, his eyes had turned completely black, like looking into deep water at night. The chanting stopped, and Melungeon spoke in English. He told Samuel that the land was soaked with the blood and tears of 7 generations of his family. That stealing it would call down a curse that would follow Samuel's bloodline until the debt was paid in full. That every Whitaker who lived on stolen ground would know suffering, would watch their children die young, would hear the voices of the displaced calling for justice in the darkness. Samuel laughed at what he called superstitious nonsense. But when he looked around the room again, the Goins family was gone. All of them, 23 people ranging from newborns to great-grandparents, had simply vanished while he was listening to the old man speak. The front door was still locked from the inside. The windows were too small for adults to crawl through. They had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed. That should have been warning enough. But Samuel moved his family onto the ridge anyway. He built a new house on the foundation of the old Goins home, using stones from their family cemetery as building materials. He plowed under their ancestral garden and planted tobacco in soil that had been blessed by 7 generations of people who understood the mountains in ways he never would. The curse started working immediately. Samuel's first child was born healthy but died in his sleep at 6 months old. The doctor found no cause of death, just noted that the baby's body was ice cold despite the warm summer night. Samuel's wife claimed she heard chanting coming from the baby's room in the hours before they found him, voices speaking words that sounded like the old Melungeon language her husband had described. Their second child lived to age 4 before wandering into the mountains during a family picnic and vanishing completely. The search parties found her clothing folded neatly on a stone that locals recognized as an old Melungeon prayer altar, but her body was never recovered. Samuel's wife swore she could hear the little girl laughing somewhere in the forest for months afterward, always just beyond the edge of hearing. The third child made it to 12 before he started sleepwalking. Every night, he would rise from his bed and walk to the old Goins family cemetery that Samuel had bulldozed to make room for his tobacco barn. The boy would stand among the broken headstones and speak to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations in a mixture of English and that strange chanting language. When Samuel tried to wake him, the boy would look at him with black eyes and speak in Melchior Goins' voice, reminding Samuel that the debt had not been paid. Samuel's journal entries became increasingly desperate as he documented the supernatural events plaguing his family. Shadow figures moved through his house at night, always walking the patterns that would have connected the rooms of the original Goins home. The sound of children playing echoed from empty fields where Melungeon kids had once run between the corn rows. And every year on June 15th, the anniversary of the eviction, Samuel would wake to find his entire family standing in the front yard, holding hands in a circle, chanting in voices that weren't to their own. By 1930, Samuel had lost 4 children and his wife to mysterious circumstances that doctors couldn't to explain and coroners wouldn't to investigate too closely. He was alone on Newman, its ridge, with his guilt and the growing realization that Melchior Goins had been right about everything. That is when Samuel made his fatal mistake. Instead of trying to make amends or find some way to honor the Goins family memory, he decided to fight the curse with violence. He brought in men from Knoxville, tough guys who didn't believe in mountain superstitions and were willing to use guns to solve problems that prayer couldn't handle. On the night of June 15, 1931, Samuel and his hired men waited in the house with loaded shotguns, planning to destroy whatever supernatural force was tormenting his family. At exactly midnight, the shadow figures appeared as they had every year. But this time, when Samuel opened fire, the shadows absorbed the buckshot and kept moving. His bullets passed harmlessly through forms that looked like the Goins family but cast no reflection in mirrors and left no footprints on dusty floors. The shadow figures surrounded Samuel's men and touched them gently on the foreheads. One by one, the hired guns collapsed. Their hearts stopped, their bodies growing cold despite the summer heat. Samuel watched his protection die in minutes, killed by the ghosts of people whose land he had stolen and whose graves he had desecrated. That is when Melchior Goins materialized in front of Samuel, looking exactly as he had 9 years earlier, but somehow more solid, more real than the living world around him. The old Melungeon patriarch explained that the curse would continue until the land was returned to his people and the Goins family was properly honored. But since Samuel had chosen violence over justice, the terms were changing. From that night forward, every male Whitaker would die before his 50th birthday. Every Whitaker child would know fear and loss before they learned to walk. The family would scatter across the country, but the curse would follow them wherever they went, because some debts can be escaped by changing addresses. Samuel wrote his final journal entry on June 16, 1931. He had decided to burn down the house and leave Newman, this ridge, forever. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The curse was in his blood now, written into his family's DNA by forces older and more patient than human understanding. He could run, but his children and grandchildren would still pay the price for his greed. I finished reading the journal at 3 in the morning, sitting in the basement of the house Samuel had built on stolen Melungeon land. My hands were shaking as I realized that everything in my family's tragic history made sense now. My grandfather dead at 47 in a car accident that witnesses swore involved a figure standing in the middle of the road who vanished on impact. My father dead at 49 from a heart attack while alone in his office, found the next morning with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. My uncle's son died at age 6 when he fell through ice on a pond that had been frozen solid minutes earlier, according to other children playing nearby. My cousin's daughter disappeared from her bedroom at age 8, leaving behind only the sound of chanting voices that neighbors reported hearing until dawn. I'm 42 years old, and I've been having the dreams for 3 months now. Every night, I see Melchior Goins standing at the foot of my bed, counting down on his fingers. 7 years left, then 6, then 5. He never speaks, but I understand that he is keeping track of my remaining time. Yesterday, I drove up to Newman, this ridge, for the first time in my life. The old house is gone, burned down decades ago, but the foundation stones are still there. I could see where Samuel had built his tobacco barn over the Goins family cemetery. And I could feel the anger rising from the disturbed graves like heat waves from summer asphalt. That is when I saw them. Dozens of shadow figures moving through the overgrown fields, walking the paths their ancestors had worn into the mountain soil. They were waiting, patient as stone, for the debt to be paid in full. They contacted the Tennessee Historical Society and the Melungeon Heritage Association. I want to deed the land back to any surviving Goins descendants and fund a proper memorial for the family Samuel destroyed. But I'm not sure it's enough anymore. The curse has been running for nearly a century, fed by the suffering of 4 generations of Whitakers who never knew why their lives were cut short. I am writing this because I need people to know the truth. The Melungeon people were real. They had legitimate claims to their ancestral lands. And they were systematically cheated by men like my great-grandfather who saw isolated mountain families as easy targets. What happened to the Goins family was repeated hundreds of times across Appalachia as outside investors and corrupt officials seized property from people who had lived on it longer than America had been a country. But some of those families knew things that the outsiders didn't understand. They knew how to bind their anger into the land itself, how to make sure that injustice would eventually be balanced by suffering, how to ensure that the guilty would pay even if it took generations. I have 8 years left before the curse claims me like it claimed my father and grandfather. Maybe I can break the cycle by making real amends, by honoring the Goins family memory and returning what was stolen. Or maybe some debts are too deep to ever be fully repaid, and my death will just be another installment on an account that my great-grandfather opened when he chose greed over justice. Either way, I want to have children. The Whitaker name dies with me. Whatever happens after that is between the dead and whatever justice looks like in the mountains where some families have been waiting a very long time for the scales to balance. If you read driving through Hancock County and you see shadow figures in your headlights on Newman, Ridge, don't stop. Just keep driving and remember that the mountains have long memories and some curses are passed down like family heirlooms, growing stronger with each generation that refuses to acknowledge the truth. The Melungeon people never really left. They're still here, still waiting, still counting down the years until every stolen acre is returned and every wrong is made right. Story 8. Red-Eyed Woodsman of the Blue Ridge. I should have listened to the old-timer at the gas station who told me some parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains aren't meant for visitors. But I thought I knew better than local superstitions. And now I'm writing this from a motel room in Waynesboro, Virginia, with my hands still shaking and my gear destroyed by something that shouldn't exist. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a freelance photographer who specializes in wilderness landscapes for outdoor magazines. I hiked alone through grizzly country in Alaska, camped in Death Valley during summer, and rappelled down cliff faces in Utah that would make most people dizzy just looking at them. I thought I understood wilderness dangers until I met the thing that guards the ancient forests of Shenandoah National Park. 3 weeks ago, I received an assignment from Outdoor America magazine to photograph old-growth forest sections that survived the logging boom of the early 1900s. The editor wanted images of trees that had been growing when George Washington was president, massive oaks and chestnuts hidden in remote valleys where commercial loggers never found them. The money was good, and I figured it would be an easy week in the mountains shooting landscapes. The park ranger at the visitor center marked several locations on my map, but he hesitated when I asked about the deepest backcountry areas. He mentioned that some sections of the park had been experiencing unusual activity lately. Camping gear found shredded by what looked like axe blades. Hikers reporting a large figure watching them from ridgetops. Strange sounds echoing through valleys at night that didn't match any known wildlife. I dismissed it as typical mountain folklore mixed with bear encounters. Every wilderness area has its local legends, and Virginia's Blue Ridge has been accumulating ghost stories since colonial times. I packed my camera equipment, lightweight camping gear, and enough food for 5 days. My plan was to hike deep into the roadless areas and document the few remaining patches of virgin forest that had somehow escaped centuries of human destruction. The first 2 days went perfectly. I photographed massive tulip poplars that were over 400 years old, their trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't reach around them. I found groves of ancient white oaks with branches that created cathedral-like spaces beneath their canopies. The light filtering through leaves that had been growing since before the Revolutionary War created exactly the mystical atmosphere the magazine wanted. But I kept feeling watched. It started as a subtle sensation, the kind of awareness you develop hiking alone in places where predators might be present. I would set up my camera equipment and notice movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Branches would sway without wind. Shadows would shift independent of the clouds passing overhead. I told myself it was just the hypervigilance that comes with solo wilderness camping, but my instincts kept insisting something was tracking me. On the third day, I hiked into a valley that the park map showed as completely roadless, a section that required 4 hours of bushwhacking to reach. The trees here were unlike anything I'd seen in the park. Some of the oaks had trunks 8 feet in diameter, with bark patterns that suggested they'd been growing for over 6 centuries. Chestnuts that should have been killed by blight decades ago towered over everything else, their canopies so dense they blocked most of the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. That's when I found the axe marks. Every ancient tree in that grove bore deep cuts in distinctive patterns. Someone had been marking these giants with a massive double-bladed axe, carving symbols into bark that was harder than most modern lumber. The cuts were fresh, exposing white wood beneath the weathered exterior, but they were made with a tool that looked like it belonged in a frontier logging camp from the 1800s. The symbols weren't too random. They followed a pattern I couldn't decipher but felt oddly familiar, like half-remembered alphabet from a nightmare. Some marks were single cuts, others were crossed lines, and a few formed circular patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. I photographed everything, thinking I might research the symbols later, but my camera kept malfunctioning. The autofocus wouldn't work properly, and the images came out blurred despite perfect lighting conditions. That night, I made camp about a quarter mile from the marked trees, following standard bear safety protocols by hanging my food and keeping my campsite clean. I set up my lightweight tent in a clearing that offered good visibility in all directions and settled in to review the day, as photographs on my camera, LCD screen. Every image was corrupted. Files that had looked perfect when I took them now showed dark shadows moving between the trees, shadows that hadn't been visible to my naked eye. In several shots, there was a figure standing among the ancient oaks, partially obscured by branches but clearly humanoid. Tall, broad-shouldered, holding what looked like a massive axe handle. I told myself it was just a combination of camera malfunction and pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But when I enlarged the images, the figure became clearer. It was a man, or something shaped like a man, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a 19th century woodsman. Flannel shirt, canvas pants, heavy boots, and where his eyes should have been, there were 2 points of red light glowing like hot coals. I deleted the corrupted files and tried to sleep, but the forest around my campsite had gone completely silent. No owls, no insects, no small mammals rustling through the underbrush. Just absolute quiet that felt wrong in a woodland environment that should have been alive with nocturnal activity. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the first axe blow. The sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot, metal biting deep into hardwood with a force that suggested the wielder had superhuman strength. It came from the direction of the marked trees, a rhythmic chopping that continued for exactly 13 strikes before stopping abruptly. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself it was just a late-night camper cutting firewood, but the silence that followed felt expectant, like something was waiting for my response. Minutes passed before the chopping resumed, this time closer to my campsite. 13 more strikes, then silence. The pattern continued all night. Every 20 minutes, 13 axe blows moving in a slow circle around my position. I tracked the sound with my compass and realized that whatever was making it was maintaining a perfect perimeter exactly 300 yards from my tent. It was herding me, keeping me contained in that clearing like livestock in a pen. At dawn, the chopping stopped. I emerged from my tent to find fresh axe marks on trees surrounding my campsite, the same mysterious symbols carved into bark that had been unmarked the night before. But these cuts were different. They formed a clear message in a language I couldn't read but somehow understood. Warning symbols, territorial markers, notifications that I had entered a domain where human rules didn't apply. I should have packed up and hiked out immediately, but professional pride made me stubborn. I'd been hired to document these ancient forests, and no local legend was going to scare me away from completing the assignment. I spent the day photographing the marked trees and exploring deeper into the valley, looking for even older specimens that might have survived since medieval times. That's when I found the lumber camp. Hidden in a hollow between 2 ridges was the remains of a logging operation that looked like it had been abandoned yesterday but felt much older. Canvas tents still stood upright despite decades of weather. Tools lay scattered around work sites as if the loggers had simply vanished in the middle of their shifts. A massive crosscut saw was embedded halfway through a chestnut trunk that was easily 8 feet in diameter, but the metal was rusted to the point of disintegration. The strangest thing was how preserved everything looked. The canvas should have rotted away years ago. The wooden tool handles should have been destroyed by insects and moisture. Instead, the entire camp existed in a state of suspended decay, frozen at the moment of abandonment like a museum exhibit under glass. I found the crew manifest in the foreman's tent, written in faded ink on paper that crumbled when I touched it. 12 men had been working this site in October 1923, cutting timber for a railroad company that needed hardwood for bridge construction. According to the log entries, they were making excellent progress until something started harassing their operation. The foreman's final entry was dated October 31st, 1923. He wrote about a figure that watched them from the ridgetops, a man who seemed to know the forest better than anyone should. The crews were reporting damaged equipment, deliberate sabotage that looked like axe work but was too precise and powerful for any normal person to accomplish. Trees they had marked for cutting were found with deep defensive wounds, as if something had been striking back at their saws and wedges. The last line of the entry chilled me. The red-eyed man came into camp last night. Boys are gone. I can hear him chopping in the darkness, but he ain't cutting trees. I left the camp and hiked back to my tent as quickly as possible, but the sun was already setting. The forest around me felt different now, charged with an awareness that followed my every movement. I could feel eyes on me from multiple directions, but when I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and shadows. That night, the chopping started earlier. This time, it wasn't maintaining a perimeter. The axe blows were moving directly toward my campsite, getting closer with each series of 13 strikes. I could hear branches breaking as something large crashed through the underbrush, moving with purpose and intelligence rather than the random patterns of wildlife. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside my tent, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The beam caught something about 50 yards away, standing motionless between two ancient oaks. It was a man, but wrong in proportions that my brain struggled to process. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders, with arms that hung longer than human anatomy should allow. He was holding a double-bladed axe that looked like it weighed more than I did, the metal head gleaming despite rust stains that covered most of its surface. His clothes were the rough work gear of a 19th century lumberjack, but they hung on his frame like they were tailored for a different species entirely. But his eyes were the worst part, 2 points of red light that seemed to generate their own illumination, casting a faint crimson glow on the trees around him. They never blinked, never moved, just stared at me with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly hostile. We looked at each other across that dark forest for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. He moved, didn't make a sound, just watched me with those burning eyes while I tried to decide whether to run or stand my ground. Then he raised his axe above his head and brought it down in a strike that split a massive oak trunk like it was made of balsa wood. The tree crashed to the ground between us, and when the dust settled, he was gone. I packed my gear in complete darkness and hiked out of that valley using my headlamp and GPS. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car 12 hours later, stumbling through mountain terrain that should have been impossible to navigate safely at night. But something was guiding my steps, keeping me on safe paths, making sure I found my way out of its territory without getting lost or injured. When I reached the trailhead, I looked back toward the mountains and saw a red glow moving along the ridgeline, tracking my departure like a guard, making sure an unwelcome visitor had truly left. I developed my photographs when I got home, and most of them were ruined by the same strange corruption I noticed in the field. But a few images came out clearly, and they showed things that shouldn't have been possible. The Red-Eyed Woodsman appeared in backgrounds where I was certain nothing had been present when I took the shots. In one photo, he was standing directly behind me, close enough to touch, with his axe raised in a striking position. I researched the 1923 lumber camp and found newspaper archives that confirmed the story. 12 loggers had vanished from a worksite in what was then private forest land, leaving behind all their equipment and personal belongings. The railroad company sent investigators who found the camp intact but abandoned, with no signs of violence or struggle. The official report blamed the disappearance on desertion, suggesting the men had simply decided to leave their jobs without notice. But local residents told a different story. They spoke of something that guarded the oldest parts of the forest, a protector spirit that wouldn't tolerate commercial exploitation of trees that had been growing since before European settlement. Loggers who respected the ancient groves and took only what they needed were left alone. Those who came with industrial equipment and profit motives were driven away by a figure with glowing red eyes who could split oak trees with single axe strokes. I never published the photographs or wrote the article for Outdoor America magazine. Some stories are too dangerous to share, and some places are meant to remain hidden from people who see wilderness as a resource to be exploited rather than a sacred space to be respected. The Red-Eyed Woodsman is still out there, still guarding those ancient forests from anyone who comes with the wrong intentions. I learned that the hard way, and lucky he decided I was worth warning rather than joining those 12 loggers who disappeared in 1923. If you planning to hike in the deep backcountry of the Blue Ridge Mountains, remember that some trees are older than our entire civilization. They've been growing since before Columbus reached America, and they survived because something has been protecting them all along. Respect that protection, and you might make it out with nothing but incredible photographs and stories to tell. Ignore it, and you might become part of a local legend yourself. Story 9. Ghost Coal Train of Hawk. This nest, I can still hear the train whistle echoing through the mountains at exactly 11:47 every night, even though the tracks were torn up 40 years ago and I live 300 miles from West Virginia now. Some sounds follow you no matter how far you run, especially when you've seen what I saw at Hawk's Nest Tunnel. My name is Marcus Webb, and I am a railroad historian who used to think I understood the difference between documented tragedy and local folklore. I spent 15 years researching abandoned railway lines across Appalachia, documenting the industrial history that built and then destroyed entire communities. I thought I was prepared for the stories I'd uncover about corporate greed and worker exploitation. I wasn't prepared for the night I witnessed 700 dead men still trying to get home. 3 months ago, I was researching the New River Line in West Virginia, specifically the Hawk's Nest Tunnel project from the early 1930s. Most people have never heard of it, but historians consider it one of the worst industrial disasters in American history. The Union Carbide Corporation needed to divert the New River to power a hydroelectric plant, which meant boring a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock that was nearly pure silica. The company hired over 3,000 workers, mostly poor men from the rural South who were desperate for jobs during the Great Depression. They were promised good wages and steady work, but Union Carbide never told them they'd be breathing crystalline silica dust that would destroy their lungs within months. The company knew the rock was dangerous, but safety equipment cost money, and dead workers were cheaper to replace than proper ventilation systems. Over 700 men died from silicosis, their lungs turning to stone as they slowly suffocated on the dust they inhaled while digging that tunnel. Most were buried in unmarked graves, their families never notified, their deaths never officially recorded. Union Carbide covered up the disaster so effectively that it took decades for the full scope of the tragedy to emerge. I was documenting the abandoned railway infrastructure that had supported the tunnel project when I decided to spend a few days camping near the old work sites. The original tracks were long gone, but I could still trace the route the coal trains had followed, carrying away the silica-rich rock that the workers had died to excavate. Local people warned me not to camp near the tunnel entrance on certain nights. They claimed you could still hear the ghost train running its route, loaded with phantom coal and the spirits of workers who never made it home to their families. I dismissed it as typical Appalachian folklore, the kind of stories that grow around industrial tragedies to give meaning to senseless loss. That was my first mistake. I set up camp on October 15th, about half a mile from the tunnel mouth, in a clearing that offered a good view of the New River Gorge. The autumn colors were spectacular, and the late afternoon light created perfect conditions for photographing the industrial ruins that dotted the landscape. I spent the day documenting concrete foundations, rusted machinery, and the entrance to the tunnel itself, a dark mouth carved into the mountain that seemed to swallow light. As sunset approached, the temperature dropped faster than weather reports had predicted. Mist began rising from the river, creating an eerie atmosphere that reminded me why the area was called Hawk's Nest. The fog rolled up from the gorge in patterns that looked almost deliberate, following contours that suggested the presence of structures that were no longer there. Around 9 p.m., I heard the first whistle. It was faint, distant, the kind of steam locomotive call that hadn't been heard on active railways for decades. I checked my watch and noted the time, thinking it might be a heritage railroad running evening excursions somewhere in the valley. But the sound was coming from the direction of the abandoned tunnel, and I knew there were no active tracks within 50 miles of my location. The whistle came again at 9:23, closer this time and accompanied by the rhythmic sound of wheels on rails. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the tunnel entrance, thinking I might be hearing echoes from a distant freight line bouncing off the mountain walls in unusual ways. But as I got closer, the sounds became impossible to explain by acoustic tricks. I could hear the chuff of a steam engine working hard up a grade, the squeal of brakes being applied, the clatter of coal cars coupling and uncoupling. These weren't distant echoes. They were coming from directly ahead of me, from tracks that had been removed before I was born. That is when I saw the light. A bright white beam was shining from the tunnel mouth, cutting through the fog like a searchlight. It swept back and forth across the landscape in the pattern a locomotive headlight would make as it navigated curves and switches. But there was no locomotive, no tracks, nothing but empty air and mountain mist. I stood transfixed as the light grew brighter and the engine sounds grew louder. Whatever was making that noise was approaching the tunnel exit at considerable speed, and I was standing directly in its path. Every rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing some kind of acoustic hallucination, but my survival instincts were screaming at me to get out of the way. That is when the ghost coal train emerged from its nest tunnel. It materialized out of the darkness like a photograph developing in slow motion. First, the headlight, blindingly bright and casting long shadows across terrain where no physical light source existed. Then the locomotive itself, a massive steam engine from the 1930s with a cowcatcher design I recognized from historical photographs of the New River Line. Behind the engine came car after car of coal hoppers, each one loaded with black rock that glittered in the supernatural light. I counted 47 cars before I lost track, a train so long its rear cars were still inside the tunnel when the locomotive was already a quarter mile beyond the entrance. But it was the crew that made my blood freeze. Standing on the locomotive, its running boards were men in work clothes from the Depression era, their faces covered with coal dust and silica powder that made them look like living statues. They moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced railroaders, checking gauges and adjusting controls. But their movements were too slow, too deliberate, as if they were operating underwater. As the train passed my position, I could see into the coal cars. They weren't filled with rock. They were packed with more workers, hundreds of men standing shoulder to shoulder in the hoppers, all facing the same direction, all staring ahead with expressions of infinite sadness and resignation. Their clothes were the same rough work gear the tunnel diggers had worn, and their faces showed the gaunt features of men dying from lung disease. The train was silent as it passed, despite the engine sounds I'd been hearing. No wheel noise, no steam hiss, no mechanical clattering, just the whistle, which continued to blow at regular intervals as the locomotive headed down the grade toward the river. I followed the phantom train, staying parallel to its route but keeping enough distance to feel safe from whatever supernatural forces were at work. The locomotive followed the exact path of the original New River Line, navigating curves and grade changes on rails that existed only in the memory of the landscape. As we approached the old loading facility where the real coal trains had once transferred their cargo to river barges, the ghost coal train began to slow. The workers in the hoppers turned their heads toward me in perfect unison, 700 pairs of eyes that reflected the locomotive, its headlight like mirrors. That's when I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just a haunted train. It was a memorial, a nightly reenactment of the journey these men should have made home to their families instead of to unmarked graves. They were still trying to complete the trip that death had interrupted, still working the job that had killed them, still serving the company that had sacrificed their lives for profit. The train stopped at the old loading dock, and the workers began climbing out of the coal cars with movements that looked like they were fighting against invisible restraints. They formed orderly lines on the platform, just as they must have done during shift changes when they were alive. But instead of heading home to company housing, they walked toward a section of riverbank where historical records indicated Union Carbide had buried the silicosis victims in mass graves. One by one, the workers disappeared into the ground, sinking through soil and stone as if the earth itself were welcoming them back. The locomotive waited patiently as hundreds of dead men returned to their eternal rest, its headlight dimming gradually until only a faint glow remained. The last worker to leave the train was different from the others. He wore a supervisor's hat and carried a clipboard that he consulted before looking directly at me. Even from a distance of 50 yards, I could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that a living person had witnessed something that was meant to remain hidden. He walked toward me with the same underwater movements that characterized all the phantom workers, but his approach felt more purposeful, more individual. When he was close enough for me to see his face clearly, I realized he looked familiar. I'd seen his photograph in historical documents about the Hawk's Nest disaster. This was Thomas Cornelius, the tunnel foreman who had tried to warn Union Carbide executives about the dangerous working conditions. He'd written letters to company officials describing the lung problems that were killing his crews, begging for safety equipment and better ventilation. The company ignored his warnings and eventually fired him for being what they called an agitator. Cornelius died of silicosis 6 months after losing his job, one of the 700 men whose deaths Union Carbide never officially acknowledged. But even in death, he was still trying to do his job, still trying to protect the workers under his supervision. He handed me his clipboard, and I could feel the weight of it despite knowing it couldn't be physically real. The pages contained names, hundreds of them, written in the careful handwriting of a man who understood that documentation might be the only justice his workers would ever receive. These were the men who had died digging Hawk's Nest Tunnel, complete with their hometowns, next of kin, and dates of death. Information that Union Carbide had deliberately destroyed to avoid compensation claims and legal liability. Thomas Cornelius had spent 90 years compiling this record, making sure every victim was remembered, every name preserved. He pointed toward the tunnel entrance, then at his clipboard, and I understood what he wanted. The ghost coal train would keep running every night until someone told their story properly, until the world knew what had really happened at Hawk's Nest and who had paid the price for corporate greed. The foreman faded away as dawn approached, and the phantom locomotive gave one final whistle before disappearing into the tunnel mouth. I was left standing alone on the abandoned loading dock, holding a clipboard that had become real enough for me to carry home. I spent the next 3 months researching every name on Thomas Cornelius' list, tracking down descendants and documenting the human cost of the Hawk's Nest disaster. The story I published won journalism awards and led to memorials being erected for the forgotten victims. Union Carbide, as corporate successors, were forced to acknowledge their predecessor's role in one of America's worst industrial tragedies. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. Last week, I returned to Hawk's Nest Tunnel on the anniversary of my first encounter with the ghost coal train. I waited until 11:47 p.m., listening for the whistle that had haunted my dreams for months. It never came. The phantom train has finally completed its route, delivered its cargo of memory and recognition to the world of the living. 700 workers have found the justice they were denied in life, and their foreman can finally rest knowing his final report was submitted and accepted. The tunnel entrance is quiet now, just another abandoned relic of Appalachian industrial history. But sometimes, when the mist rises from the New River and the autumn wind carries sounds from impossible distances, I think I can still hear Thomas Cornelius calling out the names of his men, making sure every worker is accounted for before the shift ends and they can finally go home. Story 10. Last transmission, the camera was still recording when they found it, buried under 3 feet of snow near Klingman's Dome. The battery should have died weeks ago, but somehow it kept running, capturing nothing but static and the sound of wind through dead trees. I work for the National Park Service, and I've seen my share of missing hiker cases. But nothing prepared me for what we discovered on that memory card. Nothing prepared me for the voices. It started as a routine search and rescue operation. 5 experienced hikers had vanished from the Appalachian Trail during an unexpected February blizzard. Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, David Torres, Rebecca Martinez, and James Sullivan. All seasoned backcountry enthusiasts with decades of combined experience. They knew these mountains better than most rangers. Their last check-in was February 14th at the Smoky Mountains Visitor Center. They planned a 7-day winter camping expedition through some of the most remote sections of the trail. When they failed to return, their families contacted us immediately. The search began on February 22nd. Helicopter thermal imaging detected their abandoned campsite on the 3rd day, nestled in a valley that doesn't appear on any current topographical maps. What we found there defied explanation. 5 tents arranged in a perfect circle, all slashed open from the inside. Personal belongings scattered across the snow in patterns that made no sense. Expensive gear left behind, including GPS devices and emergency beacons. Their footprints led away from camp in different directions, barefoot impressions in snow that would have killed them within minutes. But the camera changed everything. I was the one who found it, half buried beneath Rebecca's shredded sleeping bag. A high-end digital model with night vision capabilities. The kind serious documentarians use. The memory card contained 43 hours of footage spanning 6 days. The first 36 hours showed exactly what you'd expect. Happy hikers setting up camp. cooking meals, sharing stories around a small fire. Marcus filmed everything with the enthusiasm of someone documenting an adventure. They were having fun. Day 4 was when things started changing. The footage showed them discussing strange sounds they'd been hearing at night. Not animal sounds, Sarah emphasized while staring directly into the camera. Something else entirely. Something that seemed to move in patterns around their camp, always staying just beyond the reach of their flashlights. David mentioned finding unusual tracks that morning. Not bear prints, not human prints. Something in between, he said, but with too many toes. Rebecca filmed the tracks, and I've studied that footage hundreds of times. The impressions in the snow look almost human, except for the elongated digits and what appears to be claws at the tips. By day 5, their demeanor had completely changed. The cheerful banter disappeared, replaced by nervous whispers and constant glances over shoulders. Marcus kept the camera running, but his hands shook noticeably while filming. The audio picked up something else too. Faint sounds in the background that didn't match anything in their immediate environment. It sounded like breathing that wasn't quite right. Too deep, too slow, with an odd rasping quality that made my skin crawl every time I listened to it. The final day, his footage is where everything falls apart. The video begins at dusk with Marcus setting the camera on a tripod inside his tent. He whispers to it like he's recording a confession. His face is gaunt, eyes darting constantly toward the tent walls. He explains that they've been hearing voices since the previous night. Familiar voices calling their names from the darkness beyond their camp. The problem was, all 5 hikers were accounted for inside their tents when the voices started. Marcus describes hearing Sarah's voice calling for help from the woods, even though Sarah was zipped up in her tent just 20 feet away. When they called out to confirm she was safe, Sarah responded from inside her tent. But the voice in the woods kept calling, using the exact same words and inflection. Then David heard his own voice echoing back from the darkness, repeating conversations he had earlier that day. Perfect mimicry, but with subtle changes that made it wrong somehow. Like someone had recorded his voice and was playing it back with tiny delays and distortions. The footage from that final night is almost unwatchable. Around 11 p.m., the sounds begin. Footsteps circling their camp, but the pattern is wrong. Too many steps, moving in ways that don't match human locomotion. The camera's audio enhancement picks up breathing from multiple directions, all slightly out of sync with each other. Then the voices start. First, it's Rebecca's voice calling from the woods, asking why they left her behind. But Rebecca is visible in the camera frame, sitting inside her tent with her hands pressed over her ears. The voice keeps calling, getting closer, repeating her exact speech patterns but saying things she never said. Next comes James's voice, laughing in a way that sounds almost normal until you realize it never stops. It goes on, that same laugh cycling repeatedly, like a broken recording. The real James appears in the frame, pale and shaking, staring at the tent ceiling as his own laughter echoes from the darkness outside. By midnight, all 5 voices are calling from the woods simultaneously. Perfect copies of their speech patterns, their accents, their unique ways of pronouncing certain words. But the things these voices say are wrong. They speak about memories that never happened, conversations that never took place, plans they never made. The worst part is how the voices respond to each other, carrying on conversations in the darkness using their own identities. Marcus' voice argues with Sarah's voice about a decision they never discussed. David's voice comforts Rebecca's voice about fears she never expressed. It's like listening to ghost versions of themselves debating in the night. At 12:37 a.m., something brushes against Marcus' tent. The camera captures his reaction as the tent wall pressed inward, showing the clear outline of a hand. But the proportions are wrong. The fingers are too long, the palm too narrow. It drags along the tent fabric with a sound like fingernails on canvas, leaving behind tears that let in the bitter mountain air. That is when they run. The footage becomes chaotic as Marcus grabs the camera and abandons his tent. All 5 hikers burst from their shelters simultaneously, dressed only in thermal underwear and boots. The camera bounces wildly as Marcus runs, but the audio captures everything. Their panicked breathing mingles with the sound of footsteps pursuing them through the snow. But there are too many footsteps, far too many, and between their gasps and cries, you can hear their own voices calling after them from behind, begging them to come back, promising they're safe now. The footage shows glimpses of their pursuers in the camera, this night vision mode. Dark shapes moving between the trees, but they don't move like anything natural. They flow rather than run, shifting and undulating in ways that hurt to watch. Sometimes they appear almost human. Sometimes they look like something else entirely. The audio becomes increasingly distorted as Marcus runs deeper into the woods. The voices chasing them grow louder and more numerous, but they were all speaking in the hikers' own voices now. Multiple versions of each person, overlapping and echoing, creating a cacophony of familiar sounds that convey nothing but wrongness. At one point, the camera captures Sarah falling behind the group. She turns toward the camera, her face a mask of pure terror, and mouths the word, "Help." But from the darkness behind her comes another voice, Sarah, this voice, saying, "Don't worry, I'm right here." It's the last clear image of any of them. The final 17 minutes of footage show nothing but Marcus running through increasingly dense forest, the camera pointed mostly at the ground. The audio tells the real story. His breathing becomes more labored, more desperate. The pursuing footsteps never fade, and the voices keep multiplying, more versions of themselves joining the hunt with each passing minute. The last coherent words on the recording are Marcus whispering to the camera as he stumbles through the snow. They know everything they ever said. Every word, using our voices against us. Then the audio distorts completely. What follows sounds like human speech, but processed through something that doesn't. Do you understand how human speech works? Words blend into each other, syllables stretch and contract at random, and underneath it all is that same wrong breathing from the first night, now coming from dozens of sources at once. The final frames show Marcus falling face first into the snow. The camera lands at an angle, still recording his motionless form. For the next 6 hours, until the battery finally dies, it captures nothing but his body slowly being covered by falling snow. But the audio never stops completely. Even as the battery weakens and the recording becomes increasingly faint, you can still hear voices in the background. All 5 hikers, having conversations that make no sense, using words in combinations that sound almost right but fundamentally wrong. Like someone learning to speak by mimicking sounds they don't. Do you understand? We never found the bodies. The search continued for 2 more weeks, but the weather made it impossible to cover the terrain thoroughly. When spring came, we tried again. The campsite was still there, but the footprints had melted away. No trace of the 5 hikers remained except for that camera and the voices it recorded. I've listened to that final recording hundreds of times, trying to understand what happened in those mountains. The audio experts we consulted couldn't explain the distortions. The speech patterns match the hikers perfectly, but there are subtle inconsistencies that suggest the voices aren't entirely natural. The most disturbing discovery came when we analyzed the background audio from the entire week of footage. Those breathing sounds, those footsteps circling their camp, they were present from the very first day. Whatever was watching them had been there from the beginning, learning their voices, studying their behavior, waiting for the right moment. 3 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was another memory card, this one labeled Day 8. The footage shows the same campsite, but now it is occupied by 5 figures that look exactly like the missing hikers. They were going through the same motions, setting up tents, cooking meals, even having the same conversations. But they never blink, not once in 3 hours of footage. And sometimes, when they think they were not being observed, they turn toward the camera and smile with expressions that don't belong on human faces. I tried to forget what I saw on those recordings, but the voices won. They let me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them calling from the darkness outside my house. Marcus, his voice asking if I want to go camping. Sarah, his voice promising it will be fun. David, his voice saying they were still waiting for me in the mountains. The worst part is, they sound exactly right. Perfect copies of voices I only heard in recordings. But they know things about me that those hikers never could have known. Personal details, private fears, secrets I have never shared with anyone. Which means whatever took them in those mountains is still learning. Still growing. Still collecting voices from anyone who ventures too deep into places where human footsteps rarely fall. The Appalachian Trail spans over 2,000 miles of wilderness. Every year, experienced hikers vanish without explanation. Their gear is found, but their bodies never are. The search teams always report the same things: abandoned campsites, footprints leading nowhere, And sometimes, if they listen carefully enough, familiar voices calling from the darkness beyond their flashlights. We tell their families it was exposure, or wild animals, or simple misfortune. We don't mention the recordings we sometimes find, or the voices that shouldn't exist, or the growing collection of memory cards locked away in a vault that no one talks about. Because some things are better left in the mountains, where they belong. But late at night, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear them calling. All those missing voices, preserved forever in something that learned to speak by listening to us die. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you might hear your own voice calling back. Story 11. Watchers in the walls. The smell hit me first when I opened that door. Rotting food mixed with something else, something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. I've been investigating crime scenes for 12 years, but nothing prepared me for what I found in that house in Sneedville. I am Detective Ray Morrison with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in March. A postal worker reported mail piling up at the Hartwell family home for 3 weeks. Neighbors said they hadn't seen movement in the windows. No lights, no sign of life. The Hartwells were well known in their hollow. Tom worked at the sawmill. His wife Linda taught at the elementary school, and their 2 kids, Emma and Michael, were honor roll students. Normal family living in a normal house, until normal stopped making sense. When we got the warrant and entered the property, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area around their house. The front door was locked from the inside. All windows were not just closed but sealed with duct tape around the frames. We had to break in through the back door, and that is when the smell overwhelmed us. Inside, we found the family. Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, head down, hands folded. Linda was on the couch in the living room, staring at the wall. The children were in their bedrooms, Emma curled up in her closet, Michael under his bed. All of them had been dead for weeks. But here is what the official report doesn't tell you. Here is what we couldn't put in writing because nobody would believe it. They had starved themselves to death while surrounded by food. The pantry was fully stocked. The refrigerator was packed with groceries, though everything had spoiled by the time we found them. Canned goods lined the shelves, boxed meals filled the cabinets. There was enough food to feed them for months, but they chose to waste away rather than eat it. The autopsy showed no signs of violence, no poison, no indication of foul play. They simply stopped eating and let themselves die. The coroner estimated they had been dead for approximately 3 weeks, meaning they spent their final days locked inside their own home, surrounded by sustenance they refused to touch. The official cause of death was listed as murder-suicide pact, but I knew better. I've seen suicide scenes, and this wasn't one of them. There were no notes, no final messages, no indication of depression or mental illness. Medical records showed a healthy, happy family with no history of psychological problems. What bothered me most were the walls. Every room in that house showed evidence of extensive damage to the interior walls. Holes punched through drywall, scratches gouged into wooden support beams, entire sections torn away and never repaired. It looked like someone had been trying to get inside the walls, or something had been trying to get out. I started interviewing neighbors, and that is when the real story emerged. Mrs. Patterson lived next door and had known the Hartwells for 15 years. She told me about the strange sounds that had been coming from their house for months before they died. Not during the day, she was careful to emphasize, but at night when everything should have been quiet. She described scratching noises, like mice in the walls, but too loud and too rhythmic. Sometimes it sounded like something moving between the walls, traveling from room to room in patterns that didn't match the house's layout. Other nights, she heard what sounded like whispering, though she could never make out words. The mail carrier, Bob Stevens, mentioned that Tom Hartwell had started acting strange in the weeks before they stopped appearing. He would answer the door looking exhausted, constantly glancing over his shoulder back into the house. When Bob asked if everything was okay, Tom just said they were having some problems with pests and closed the door. Linda, his sister, Carol, told me about a phone call she received from Linda 2 weeks before we found the bodies. Linda was whispering into the phone, saying she couldn't talk long because they might hear her. When Carol asked who might hear her, Linda just said they lived in the walls now and hung up. But it was Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who gave me the detail that changed everything. Emma had been missing school for 3 weeks before the family stopped being seen entirely. When Mrs. Rodriguez called to check on her, Emma answered the phone herself and said she couldn't come to school anymore because the family wasn't allowed to leave the house. When pressed for details, Emma whispered that they had made the walls angry and now they had to stay inside until the walls forgave them. I returned to the house the next day with a structural engineer and a pest control specialist. We needed to understand what had been living in those walls, what could have frightened an entire family to death. The pest control expert found no evidence of rodent infestation. No droppings, no nests, no signs of typical household pests. But he did find something else. Inside the walls, between the studs and behind the insulation, were spaces that shouldn't have existed. Hollow areas carved out of the original structure, too organized to be natural, too precise to be accidental damage. The structural engineer was baffled. He said someone had systematically removed sections of the interior wall framework, creating a network of passages that ran throughout the entire house. The work was sophisticated, requiring knowledge of load-bearing walls and electrical systems. Whoever did it knew construction. But here is what didn't make sense. The modifications were all made from inside the walls themselves. There was no evidence of entry points, no areas where someone could have accessed the wall cavities from inside the house. The passages had been carved from within, as if something had been living in the walls and gradually expanding its territory. We found other things in those hidden spaces, food wrappers, but not from anything the Hartwells had been eating. Strange symbols carved into wooden beams, patterns that looked almost like writing but in no language any of us recognized. And photographs, hundreds of photographs. All of them showed the Hartwell family going about their daily routines, but taken from impossible angles. Pictures shot from inside walls, from spaces where no camera could fit. Images of them sleeping, eating, watching television, completely unaware they were being observed. The photos spanned months, showing the family gradually becoming more anxious, more paranoid, more afraid. The final photos were the worst. They showed the family during their last days, huddled together in the living room, staring at the walls with expressions of pure terror. In these pictures, you could see the walls themselves beginning to bulge outward, as if something large was pressing against them from the inside. I took the photos to a forensic analyst who specialized in unusual cases. She confirmed what I already suspected. The pictures were taken with equipment that didn't exist in any consumer market. The angles and focal lengths were impossible with standard cameras. But more disturbing was her analysis of the subjects themselves. According to her measurements, the Hartwells in the final photographs were smaller than they should have been. Not just thinner from starvation, but actually reduced in scale, as if they were somehow shrinking while whatever was in the walls was growing larger. 3 days later, I made a decision that probably ended my career. I spent a night in the Hartwell house. I set up cameras in every room and positioned audio recording equipment throughout the structure. I wanted to document whatever had driven that family to starve themselves to death. I needed to know what was still living in those walls. The first few hours were quiet. I sat in the living room where Linda had died, monitoring the recording equipment and watching for any signs of activity. Around 10 p.m., the sounds began. It started as a faint scratching, like fingernails on wood. The sound came from inside the walls, moving in slow circuits around the room. I followed it with my flashlight, but of course there was nothing to see. Just walls that bulged slightly as something passed behind them. By midnight, the scratching had become more aggressive. Now it sounded like multiple sources, things moving through the wall passages in coordinated patterns. My audio equipment picked up sounds that resembled whispers, but played back at different speeds. They sounded more like breathing than speech. Around 2 a.m., I heard my own voice. It came from inside the walls, muffled but clearly audible. My voice saying things I had never said, having conversations I had never had. The words were all mine, my accent, my speech patterns, but arranged in combinations that made no sense. Like someone had recorded everything I ever said and was now playing the sounds back randomly. That is when I understood what had happened to the Hartwells. Whatever lived in those walls didn't just watch them. It learned from them. It absorbed their voices, their mannerisms, their private moments, and began using that knowledge against them. The family hadn't starved themselves out of fear. They had been replaced slowly and systematically by something that was learning to be them. The photos I found weren't just surveillance. They were reference materials, documenting every detail so whatever was in the walls could practice being human. I packed up my equipment and left the house at sunrise. The official investigation was closed, the case filed away as an unexplained tragedy. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, the lot sold to a developer who built a small apartment complex on the site. But I kept watching. Over the following months, I tracked missing persons reports throughout East Tennessee. People who disappeared from their homes without explanation, leaving behind signs of wall damage and hidden passages. Families who abandoned their houses in the middle of the night, claiming something was living in the walls. The pattern was always the same: strange sounds at night, modifications to interior walls, and eventually, people who stopped being themselves. I tried to warn other investigators, but without evidence, my reports were dismissed as stress-related paranoia. My superiors suggested I take early retirement, and I did, but I never stopped tracking the cases. The last confirmed sighting was in a small town outside Gatlinburg. A family of 4 reported strange sounds in their walls and requested a police wellness check. When officers arrived, they found the house empty but with clear evidence of recent habitation. Food was still warm on the stove. Television was still playing, but no sign of the family. The walls showed the same systematic damage I'd seen in the Hartwell house. And in the basement, investigators found something new: a collection of clothing, personal items, and identification documents, all arranged as if someone was studying how to use them. But what scared me most was finding my own business card among the items. The card I'd given to Tom Hartwell during my initial investigation, before I knew what was really happening in that house. Which means whatever killed the Hartwells has been watching me too, learning my routines, studying my habits, preparing to become me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching in my own walls. Faint at first, but growing stronger. They started sleeping with all the lights on, and they sealed every crack and gap I can find. But I know the matter, whatever lives in walls doesn't need doors to get inside. It just needs time to learn who you are, and then it takes your place so slowly you never notice until it's too late. The worst part is knowing that by the time you hear your own voice whispering back from inside the walls, it's already won. Because the thing about being replaced is that you never know when it's already happened. Another Appalachian tale fades, but echoes remain. Thank you for stepping off the safe path with me tonight. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. And tell me, where are you listening from? Have your hills ever whispered back? Share your story below, if you're brave enough. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep calling.